For 30 years, thousands of soldiers had followed his orders. He had developed strategies on battlefields, made critical decisions that saved lives and won wars. Now he was serving food to college students in a university cafeteria. No one knew who he was. They just saw him as a kind, elderly worker. Until that afternoon, when young Sarah, while getting her lunch, noticed the metal chain hanging from the man's pocket. And that metal bore an honor that only very special people could carry. When Sarah recognized that symbol, her heart stopped, because standing before her was one of the legendary commanders she had read about in textbooks. Welcome to Unhidden Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden greatness, unexpected discovery, and the price of true leadership, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. Some heroes never stop serving, they just change uniforms. The University of Colorado Dining Hall opened at 11 a.m. sharp, and Robert Mitchell was always there by 10:30, checking inventory, preparing the lunch service, and making sure everything ran smoothly. At 68 years old, he'd been working in the cafeteria for 8 years, and students knew him simply as Mr. Bob, the friendly man behind the hot food counter who always had a smile and never seemed to have a bad day. Bob wore the standard cafeteria uniform: khaki pants, white shirt, hairnet, and name tag that read simply, Robert. He moved with efficiency and purpose, but nothing about his demeanor suggested he'd ever been anything more than a food service worker. Students would chat with him briefly while getting their meals, but the conversations never went beyond pleasantries about the weather or how their studies were going. What they didn't know was that every morning before work, Bob still woke up at 0500 hours, made his bed with military precision, and read 3 newspapers cover to cover. Old habits from a lifetime of command never really died. Sarah Martinez was a 21-year-old junior majoring in military history with a focus on modern warfare. She was writing her senior thesis on leadership during the Gulf War and spent most of her free time buried in books about Desert Storm, studying the tactics and strategies that had made it one of the most successful military campaigns in modern history. Like most students, Sarah had a routine. She'd grab lunch at the same time every day, usually something quick from the hot food line, then find a quiet corner to continue her research. She'd gotten her food from Mr. Bob hundreds of times, always polite, always appreciative, but never really seeing him as anything more than part of the university's background. That Tuesday started like any other. Sarah was running late from her military strategy seminar, where they'd been discussing the rapid ground assault that had ended the Gulf War in just 100 hours. She rushed into the dining hall, grabbed a tray, and headed to the hot food counter where Bob was serving today's special: meatloaf and mashed potatoes. "How are you today, Sarah?" Bob asked, recognizing her as one of his regular customers. "Good, Mr. Bob. Just trying to finish this thesis that's driving me crazy." "What's it about?" Military leadership during Desert Storm. I'm trying to understand how the commanders made such complex decisions so quickly." Bob paused for just a moment while spooning mashed potatoes onto her plate. Interesting topic. As he reached across the counter to hand her the plate, his uniform shirt pulled slightly and something caught Sarah's eye. There was a thin chain around his neck, barely visible, and hanging from it was what looked like a medal tucked inside his shirt. But more importantly, as his sleeve rode up, she glimpsed what looked like an old scar on his forearm. Not the kind you get from kitchen work, but the kind that comes from shrapnel. "Mr. Bob," she said carefully, "did you serve in the military?" He smiled, but something in his eyes changed. "Long time ago." "Which branch?" "Hawkcrow Army." He handed her utensils and moved to serve the next student. But Sarah wasn't ready to move on. Something about his posture, the way he'd paused when she mentioned Desert Storm, the precision of his movements, it all felt familiar from her research. Later that afternoon, Sarah returned to the dining hall for coffee. The lunch rush was over and Bob was cleaning the serving area. She watched him work, noticing things she'd never paid attention to before: the economy of motion, the systematic approach to cleaning, the way he surveyed the entire dining room like he was assessing terrain. As he moved between tables, something fell from his pocket. It hit the floor with a distinctive metallic sound that made several students look up. Sarah was closest and bent to pick it up. Her hand froze before she could touch it. It was a medal. Not just any medal, but one she recognized immediately from her research. The distinctive star shape, the light blue ribbon with white stars, the weight of history it carried. The Congressional Medal of Honor. She picked it up with trembling hands and read the engraving. Robert Mitchell, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Desert Storm. Bob had turned around and was walking back toward her, probably wondering what had dropped. When he saw what she was holding, he stopped. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah looked at the medal, then at Bob, then back at the medal. Her mind was racing through everything she'd read, every battle account, every leadership study. "General Mitchell?" she whispered. Bob's expression didn't change, but he nodded once. "It's just Bob now." Sarah's hands were shaking as she held the Medal of Honor. She'd written about this medal, this man, this battle. General Robert Mitchell wasn't just a footnote in military history. He was one of the most respected commanders of the modern era. "Sir," she said, her voice barely audible, You're in my thesis." "Am I?" The flanking maneuver at Kafji. The decision to advance the timeline when weather conditions changed. The extraction of the 2nd Battalion when they were cut off. Sarah's academic training kicked in, and she found herself reciting facts like she was giving a presentation. "You saved 200 soldiers and shortened the war by weeks." Bob looked around the dining hall, making sure other students weren't listening. "Sarah, could we talk somewhere more private?" They found an empty conference room adjacent to the dining hall. Bob closed the door and sat across from Sarah, who was still holding his Medal of Honor like it might disappear if she let go. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Why are you serving food when you could be teaching at West Point or consulting for the Pentagon?" Bob was quiet for a long moment. "Because this is where I need to be." "After I retired," Bob began, "I tried the consulting thing, went to Washington, advised on policy, gave speeches about leadership, but every conversation was about the next war, the next conflict, the next time we'd need to send young people into harm's way." He looked out the window at students walking across campus. "I got tired of talking about war. I wanted to do something that helped people without anyone having to fight. But you could teach, share your knowledge." "I am teaching every day." Sarah looked confused. "Serving meatloaf is teaching?" Bob smiled. "You'd be surprised what you can learn about leadership by watching how people treat someone they think is beneath them." Over the next hour, Bob explained his philosophy.
The dining hall had become his laboratory for studying human nature and leadership potential.
"Every day, I watch students interact with staff. I see who says thank you, who treats service workers with respect, who helps when someone drops their tray. Those are the real leadership indicators." "And what do you see?" "Future officers who will take care of their soldiers, and future officers who won't." Bob's expression grew serious. "The ones who are rude to cafeteria workers will be rude to privates. The ones who help clean up spills will be the ones who stay behind to help their squad." Sarah began to understand. "You're identifying leaders." "I'm watching character in action. It's more reliable than any test or simulation." "There's more," Bob continued. "I write letters." "Letters?" "To ROTC programs, to military academies, to commanding officers. When I see a student who demonstrates real leadership character, I let people know." Sarah's eyes widened. "You're recruiting?" "Yeah, I'm identifying. There's a difference." Tommy Rodriguez, who graduated last year, he helped an older staff member lift heavy boxes every week for 2 years, never asked for recognition, never expected anything. I wrote a letter. He's now an officer candidate school. And Jessica Chen, who organized students to thank the cleaning crew during finals week, she's at Annapolis. Bob had been using his position to quietly identify the next generation of military leaders based on character rather than test scores or family connections. "Sarah," Bob said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, sir." "In all your research about Desert Storm, what do you think was my most important decision?" Sarah thought about everything she'd read. The flanking maneuver? The timeline advancement? Bob shook his head. "The most important decision I made was which officers to trust with independent command when communications broke down." "How did you choose? By watching how they treated their soldiers when they thought no one was looking? The officers who checked on their troops' feet during marches, who shared their rations during shortages, who remembered the names of every soldier in their unit, those were the ones I trusted with critical missions." Sarah was beginning to see the connection, and you're doing the same thing here. Character reveals itself in small moments, Sarah. How someone treats a cafeteria worker is how they'll treat a soldier. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Because you've been coming here for 2 years and you've never once failed to say thank you. You've helped other students find seats, you've cleaned up messes that weren't yours, and you spend your free time studying military history because you want to understand leadership." Bob paused. "And because yesterday, I watched you give your lunch to a homeless veteran outside the student union." Sarah had forgotten about that. An elderly man with a Vietnam veteran cap had been sitting outside, clearly hungry. She'd given him her meal without thinking about it. "That told me everything I needed to know about your character." "What does that mean?" Bob pulled a business card from his wallet. "There's a program for graduate students interested in military history and leadership. Full scholarship, direct commissioning track, opportunity to work with some of the best strategic minds in the country." Sarah looked at the card. It was from the National Defense University. "They've been asking me to recommend candidates. I've been waiting for the right one." Word of Bob's identity spread slowly through the university, but not in the way Sarah expected. Rather than becoming a celebrity, Bob found himself with a different kind of recognition. The students who had been rude to cafeteria staff began treating them better. Faculty members who had never acknowledged the service workers started learning their names. The dining hall became a more respectful place. Dr. Patricia Williams, head of the Military History Department, requested a meeting with Bob. She'd verified his identity and wanted to offer him a teaching position. "Thank you," Bob told her, "but I'm happy where I am." "But you could reach so many more students in a classroom." "Dr. Williams, how many students do you think come through this dining hall every day?" "Probably 2,000. "And how many are in your largest lecture hall?" "About 300. Bob smiled. "I'll stay where I can see the most students." Bob's revelation led to changes in how he worked. While he kept his cafeteria job, he began having informal conversations with students who showed interest in military service or leadership. Sarah became his unofficial assistant, helping to identify students who demonstrated character and connecting them with Bob for mentoring conversations. The corner table in the dining hall became known as General's Table, where Bob would hold court during slow periods, sharing insights about leadership, decision-making, and service. Leadership, he would tell students, isn't about the rank on your collar. It's about the decision you make when no one is watching and nothing requires you to do the right thing. Bob's letters of recommendation became legendary in military circles. They didn't focus on grades or test scores, but on character observations that proved remarkably predictive of military success. One letter read, "Student demonstrates consistent integrity in small matters. Observed helping disabled veteran with groceries and parking lot during finals week. Shows situational awareness and puts others' needs before personal convenience. Recommend for leadership development." Another, "Candidate exhibits natural protective instincts, consistently positions herself between aggressive individuals and more vulnerable students during disputes, never seeks recognition, natural leader." Military academies and ROTC programs began to specifically request Bob's assessments. knowing that his evaluations identified future officers who would genuinely care for their soldiers. As Sarah prepared to graduate, she asked Bob about his long-term goals. "I want to change how we identify leaders," he said. "Right now, we select officers based on academic achievement, physical fitness, and standardized tests. But character is harder to measure." "So you're creating a new model?" "I'm proving that character can be observed and documented. Every student I've recommended has exceeded expectations in military service because we identified them based on who they are, not just what they can do." Bob had been quietly conducting a long-term study on character-based leadership selection, using the dining hall as his laboratory. Sarah ultimately accepted the opportunity at the National Defense University. Her thesis on Desert Storm, now enriched by conversations with one of its key architects, was selected for publication. But more importantly, she understood that her real education had happened not in classrooms, but in observing how a legendary general chose to serve in retirement. "General," she said before leaving for Washington, "what's the most important thing you've taught me?" That real leaders never stop serving. They just find new ways to make a difference." "And the second most important?" Bob smiled. "That the cafeteria worker you ignore today might be the general who saves your life tomorrow." 5 years later, Sarah was serving as a young officer in Afghanistan when she received word that her unit would be working with a general known for his innovative leadership development programs. When she met General Thompson, she wasn't surprised to learn that he had been one of Bob's cafeteria discoveries from 15 years earlier. "The general taught me that leadership is about service, not authority," Thompson told her. "I've been applying his principles ever since." Sarah realized that Bob's influence was spreading through the military in ways that traditional teaching never could have achieved. Bob continued working in the dining hall until he was 75, finally retiring when the university created an endowed chair in character-based leadership in his honor. The position wasn't for a traditional academic, but for someone who would develop practical methods for identifying and developing leaders based on character rather than credentials. Sarah, now Dr. Sarah Martinez, was offered the position. "Come full circle," Bob told her at his retirement ceremony. "Teach others what you learned by watching people when they thought no one important was looking." Dr. Martinez's program became a model for leadership development programs across the country. Students learned that character was demonstrated in daily actions, that leadership was about service, and that the most important lessons often came from the most unexpected teachers. The dining hall where Bob had worked was renamed the Robert Mitchell Leadership Laboratory, recognizing that leadership could be studied and developed anywhere people gathered. For 8 years, he served food to college students while conducting the most important mission of his career, identifying the next generation of leaders based not on what they could achieve, but on who they chose to be when no one was watching. Every student who said thank you to a cafeteria worker, every person who helped clean up a spill, every individual who showed kindness to service staff was being evaluated by one of the most respected military minds of his generation. And some of them, the ones who consistently demonstrated character in small moments, received opportunities that changed their lives and strengthened their country's military leadership. The Medal of Honor on Bob's chain represented gallantry in battle, but his 8 years in the dining hall represented something even more valuable: the wisdom to know that the most important battles are fought in the quiet moments that reveal who we really are. Have you ever met someone like General Mitchell? Someone who was more than they appeared, serving in ways you never recognized until you knew their story. Tell us in the comments. Share their story, because at Human Stories, we believe that greatness often wears humble uniforms, and the most important teachers are often the ones we see every day but never really notice. Subscribe if stories like this matter to you. Because every day, heroes are serving in ways we don't recognize, teaching lessons we're not smart enough to see, and changing lives simply by treating everyone with the respect they deserve.